Okay, got it. I know we took 2 months off during the summer. So yeah, li- that's a little out of practice.
Oh, that's what it is. I was thinking, gosh, I really am losing it because I do this all the time. Like, why is this? And then I feel like I'm forgetting something too. I'm like, oh, Victor's here watching. He's gonna be like, I forgot this thing. Just kidding.
Uh, uh,
Kind
Victor's also our producer, and he's
Well,
NIGP radio and a lot of different things that you've probably seen. But he's our expert. He makes us better.
I
So
have, I, not high standards, but I just want to make it so that everybody enjoys it. And Dr. Kim, I had the pleasure of being on a panel with her at Forum, and that was that was too quick. We were just getting into stride and having fun. It's like we're done. Like, wait, we just got started. So
Yeah,
see where that goes someday.
yeah, that one needs a sequel for sure.
well, your high standards make us better. So don't blame him if I'm not professional enough. It's not his fault. He tries.
And work with the best I can with the material that they give me.
I know. I just lobbed that one out to you.
You did. Yeah, that was a softball. Thank you.
That was an easy one. Okay, well, it's 2 minutes after. How are we doing? We're still missing a lot of people. But I think we have a lot of material. I really think we should get started. Right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So I know we say disaster recovery on the screen, but we actually titled it Reframing Possible, the critical role procurement plays in rebuilding resilient communities with the use of federal funding. So on with us today, we have Dr. Kim Abrego. Is that pronounced properly?
Yes, it is.
President, Chief Operating Officer of Disaster Recovery Services, and then Shelley Vineyard, Procurement Practice Leader of Disaster Recovery Services, and they're both from NIGP's Business Council. A few more things I want to go over, and then okay, sorry. Okay, everyone, here is our upcoming events and training. Let's see, if you don't have the Mariners tickets now, it's too late. So let's just talk about some of the others. September 22nd, specialization certification. October 1st, then and now. That's the next lunch and learn. October 11th, emerging professionals. And October 12th, the competency module. And November 1, we no bid, and that's the NIGP Business Council again, a different group will be presenting. And then please, we're going to put an announcement out soon for you to register for the 20th anniversary celebration. And please change your name to your full name, and so you can have so we'll know who to give attendance to. So if you don't have your full name shown on the computer, please change that. Make sure to mute yourself so we don't hear any background noise. Questions. Dr. Kim's going to be watching for questions in the background, and they'll take questions throughout, but there'll be a question and answer time at the end. So feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. They'll be watching for it. And I will turn it over to our presenters.
All right. Thank you, Stacy. good afternoon, or good morning, good lunchtime, everybody, depending on Shelley and I are in Texas. So good to see everybody. I see some familiar names from WANIGP Forum. Glad to see you here and glad to be here. As Stacy mentioned, we're talking about reframing possible and the critical role that all of you play in building resilient communities. And understanding where you are, this topic is geographically, this topic is still relevant for a number of reasons. Disasters are increasing in frequency and severity. So we're seeing just the topographic nature of disasters shift. So just because you have not been in a disaster prone area doesn't mean that you won't be in one soon. As well as there is a lot of funding and focus currently, and we anticipate in the future with disaster related funding. And you saw that with the COVID pandemic. We're seeing that now translate into additional funding, and we'll hit it at the very end there, that IIJA funding. But just looking at the full landscape of disasters, procurement is in this interesting nexus point of understanding what your communities need, what your end users are looking for, and then where the funding is coming in from. And if you understand that for every dollar you spend on resiliency or disaster mitigation, you save between $5 and $6 on response. You can understand why we're saying that it's reframing possible and the critical role that procurement plays. So as you're talking and developing scopes for RFPs related to this funding with your end users, you can be thinking in the back of your mind about how you can weave in resilience components, or is there a potential when we're doing X to this building that we could add in Y and unlock some additional funding or improve some resilience, then maybe the end user wasn't even thinking about that. But now, because you're more aware of it and understand the broader context and impact for disaster resilience, you can weave that in at little to no cost for your community, but now you're protecting long-term. So that provides you with a little bit of the context for why we're talking about these various funding sources today. And so we're talking about them less from a procurement mechanics and details standpoint, although Shelley and I are happy to talk about that. We're procurement nerds, just like many of you are. But we're talking about it more from general awareness of funding that's out there, so that if and when you come across this funding, you go, oh, I heard about that. And I think there's a component here where I can weave in some resilience or understand a little bit more about resilience and how that could potentially benefit my community. A quick case study here. This is one that was in a county in the Midwest, and it's funding that was came from the ARPA CARES funding. It was called the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. This is it. It was applied for by the county for an arena or a live venue that sits within the county. So Intrust Bank Arena. Intrust is owned by the county, but managed by a third party, which seems to be standard for a lot of these live venue centers or arenas. The management company wanted to put in, so they received $10 million for this grant. They wanted to put in retractable seating. So it's the seating like when you're at a basketball game, the seating comes out and people can sit right on the floor and watch the game. If you're having a concert, the seating kind of accordions back, and then you've got more space on the floor for the concert. Really not disaster resilience related, but interesting in that it came off of the COVID CARES funding and part of the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant or ARPA funding. The challenge was the funds were awarded in September 2021. And the spending deadline was December 2021. And when we say spending deadline, they wanted the seats installed or the project completed by December 2021. And this was a third-party management company who's a for-profit entity that had no idea about federal procurement rules and requirements. They knew the exact supplier they wanted. They knew the color of the seats they wanted. They knew everything that they wanted. And by golly, they had $10 million and they were going to put it in. And, you know, our poor director of procurement was like, time out. We've got all of these rules we have to follow. How are we going to be able to do this and not lose the $10 million for the county? Well, one of the things that we get asked quite often, and this is why we have this case study in here, is can we use cooperative contracts with federal dollars? The answer is yes. And so 2 CFR 200.318E is actually the section in uniform guidance that points to it. And so within this county, they were able to use cooperative contracting, get the third-party contractor what they needed, leverage and use that $10 million of disaster-related money and satisfy all the rules and requirements along with the time frame. Now, the key point here is that this project could have gone on and the procurement professional could have been unaware that all of this was going on. So one of the other things that Shelley and I like to point out is that procurement and procurement departments should be, yes, Erin, I can provide you with that. I'll put it in the chat. Should be part of every conversation where there's this type of funding or these level of projects. And it sounds obvious, and I think we're getting better, but one of the topics that Shelley and I also present on is having a seat at the table. We saved you a seat at the table. If procurement wasn't hearing and part of that dialogue, this project would have happened with federal funds by a third party and not procured properly. So the more that you're involved in the dialogue with all of these various funding sources, the better off you're going to be. So with that, oh, sorry, I'm typing 318E. These are the various grants that we're going to talk about today that are related to disaster and resilience. There are many, many more out there, but with that, I'll turn it over to Shelley.
All right, thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be able to spend a little time with you this afternoon. And just as a matter of background, I spent 13 years as a chief procurement officer and contracting manager for a large public school district here in the state of Texas. We were located just north of Houston, so experienced lots of hurricanes, lots of federally declared disasters. The last one that I saw my entity through was Hurricane Harvey, where we had $100 million loss. And about 75 million of that we were forced to push to FEMA funding. So very familiar with all of these federal grant rules and things that we're going to briefly talk about today. We don't have the time to take a deep dive today, as Kim mentioned, but all of the funding sources that we're going to speak of today, they all are considered federal grants. And so they are under the rules of the uniform guidance found at 2 CFR 200. And it's really important. I know as we were talking before we got on and started the session, several people mentioned that they really hadn't been through any, real disasters recently. So, it's really important for you on these blue sky days to really make sure you're familiar with the rules, understand what the challenges are. And understand that, not only what is your plan going to be, but how are you going to communicate that plan out to your end users, right? Because most of us are large enough where we're pretty decentralized on our procurement. Everything's coming through the procurement department, but a lot of times we've got other end users in various departments, et cetera, that are making those procurement decisions. And then we find out about them when they come through for requisitioning, purchase order, et cetera. But, top 5 reasons over all reasons that federal grant funding gets deobligated or clawed back are all related to procurement missteps. So, we always say no pressure on you guys, but again, really important for you to be familiar with those rules. I'm going to just off the top of my head tell you about 5 real quickly. But before I do that, let me just give you a little bit of a plug here. Kim and I did, leading up to Forum, we had a 3-part series where we took a deep dive into all of the procurement, common procurement missteps under federal grants. And those first 2 sessions, parts 1 and 2, go into detail with all of those, rules and regulations and how to better prepare you. So if you go to the NIGP website and you just search for usual suspects, because that was the theme of our webinars. You're going to come up to 2 recorded webinars, parts 1 and 2, free to NIGP members, small charge for those that are not NIGP members. But if you want a lot more information and to take a deeper dive, those resources are available to you. But top 5 off top of my head, sole sourcing. When we're talking about disaster funding, of course, there are allowances for emergency and exigent sole sourcing, non-competitive procurements, right? We're trying to position ourselves to respond to a disaster. Sometimes, usually, we may have a local emergency declaration from our local governing bodies that say that we can suspend normal procurement for a certain period of time in order to kind of get ourselves grounded, to respond to the disaster. But what happens to folks that they don't always understand is that if you are a non-state entity, you're required to document a justification for every single use of that non-competitive procurement, even though it's in emergency or exigent circumstances. So it's really key that you have a way to capture that information from your end users, and that you're able to, sometimes you have to catch that step up in the beginning, right? But that what the circumstances were so that you can explain that. The other piece of sole sourcing is people often latch on to a non-competitive contract, sole source type situation, but they fail to pivot once things kind of calm down and you sort of know what your scope of damages are, what your scopes of work are going to be. They fail to pivot to more regular procurement processes. So that's a big one that catches people off guard quite a bit. Another is when you move into outside of the emergency and exigent period is you've got to take 6 affirmative steps for socioeconomic contracting to include your small minority diverse type firms in your procurement actions. Now, from the federal standpoint, that's not a set aside percentage amount. It's just that you are actively engaging and inviting and casting a wide net so those types of firms can participate. We've got a link in our resources that we provided along with our presentation that will take you to those 6 affirmative steps and what's required there. But the key is documenting what you're doing, making sure that somebody years down the road that's picking up this package for an audit or whatever can tell that you did take those steps to be as inclusive as possible, because we're dealing with federal funds. Beyond that, I would say cost or price analysis that's required at anything that's over the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently set at $250,000. You need to make sure there's not a specific form, or a specific format that's prescribed. It's just that you're capturing that information to explain how even during a disaster, even in, exigent circumstances, that you were trying to get the best value for your organization, with those federal funds, to be sure that you capture that. And then, of course, federal terms and conditions, all of those that are found at 2 CFR 200 Appendix 2. But depending on some of these other agencies that we're going to be talking about today, they have additional, requirements where they can apply and say we want additional terms and conditions incorporated into your final contracts, POs, etc. And then the big one that just sort of is overarching is your documentation. You cannot have too much documentation for all of these types of disaster events. It's really important that you can tell your procurement story. What was going on with that specific procurement at that time? Why did we make the decisions that we did? So that you can help somebody that's reviewing that to be able to understand where you were. And what you want to do is you want to lead them to the same conclusion that you made, right? You want to tell them as much as possible so that they agree with you, and you either get your funding or keep your funding for perpetuity. So again, developing a plan is really important when you're going to be working with these types of funds. You want to make sure that you've done the gap analysis. For non-state entities, you have to know what's the most restrictive of federal versus state versus local. And you have to follow the most restrictive of those rules, even during, a disaster declaration. Sometimes folks are not aware of what is the most restrictive, and it's not just about competitive thresholds. It's about bonding. It's about what types of solicitations that methods of solicitation that you're able to use under federal funds, etc. So developing that plan, figuring out what forms we need, how are we going to communicate out to folks when we have a disaster, how we're going to, how we're going to operate once a disaster happens is crucial to be ensuring that you're optimizing your federal funding. All right, we're going to start diving into some of these federal sources of funding, and we're going to start with our favorite, FEMA. And FEMA is, not only a needed source of funding because of, as Kim mentioned, we just have ongoing disasters that are getting larger and more catastrophic as the years go by. But it's also sometimes a necessary evil. A lot of times what people know about FEMA is that it's very arduous. It's very, takes a really long time. It's kind of a pain to deal with. But in a scenario such as what I had, when you are reliant upon $75 million that's not being covered by insurance, and you've got to find out how can we, get as much funding that's available. You really don't have a choice to say to your community, we're not going to go after that $75 million from FEMA. We're just going to, try to figure out a way within existing budgets or financing, whatever, to support that. But within FEMA, there are several different programs. The first one that we'll talk about is the traditional public assistance, or PA. I'll refer to it as PA just for short. And that's what most people are aware of that FEMA has to offer. This funding is made available once there is a federal disaster declared by the president. And depending on, the type of damage, the amount of damage, the per capita, there's a per capita formula that goes into figuring out what categories of funding are going to be made available to you as a public assistance applicant. Depending on that, the type of disaster that you have will determine those categories. But if there is a federal disaster declared on the onset, you will always have what we call category A, which is all of your debris removal. So if you're responsible for clearing roads and, ensuring safety from fallen limbs, those kinds of things, trash that's left behind from, a wind event, etc., you would have funding to help you with that. And then category B are your emergency protective measures. So anything that you're doing to try to respond immediately to that disaster to save lives, to mitigate further damage, etc., are eligible under the PA program. And before I go too much further into just talking about the program itself, let me just kind of give you a foundation. So there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of about FEMA public assistance. First thing is that it is a cost reimbursement grant. Okay, it's a little bit different than a lot of your other federal grants. Often when we're working with federal grants, we're applying for those ahead of time and we're presenting a budget for the things that we want to use the money for. And we know once we get approved, we know, okay, we've got to be able to track all of that, grant funding and know that there's special federal rules that apply. Well, with FEMA, it's cost reimbursement. Your entity is going to be having to fund all of these initial costs out of your existing budget. So, there's a lot of things that your team has to think about if you're in a disaster-prone area. What kind of cash flow are we going to need to be able to have? What are going to be our alternatives? If we don't have a real healthy fund balance, where are we going to get funding or financing, et cetera? But just know FEMA will only reimburse you for eligible work after you have proven up that you've spent the money and procured it correctly. It's also a cost share program. So typically the standard disaster cost share is 75% federal, 25% the applicant. So you will be at a minimum required to fund 25% of the overall damages that you incur. It's a partnership, if you will. when you enter with FEMA. There's certain disasters where the cost share is increased on the federal side, depending on how widespread, and maybe sometimes it's 100% during the emergency period, and then it goes back down to the 75 for permanent work or whatever. The other thing is that FEMA is the last source of funding. So you may have other funding that's available to you via the state, via other federal programs. FEMA wants to be the last source, and there can be no duplication of benefits. So all of that to say, it's really important for your organization to know how you're going to track all of your expenses, and just kind of, in the front of your mind, know that any of this could go to FEMA. We don't know what all's going to be pushed to FEMA at the early onset, but any of it could go, and then therefore the federal rules start to apply. This program, the traditional PA program, is intended to put you back to pre-disaster condition. Okay, they're going to, whatever was damaged, they're going to put that building back to pre-disaster condition. There are some other things that go along with that. I mean, one of the things about the PA program is you are tracking those costs by building and then by category of funding. So if it's your, categories A and B, or if it's your permanent work for, buildings, roads, bridges, public parks, those kinds of things, you've got to really be able to track all of that by building and by the expense. One little known fact about the PA program is that there's a really kind of, a nice, I think, allowance within that program. If you have a building, there's a calculation you can do. If your building, if the cost to repair it is in the numerator, and the denominator of that calculation is what does it cost to replace this building at fair market value. If that percentage comes up to 50% or more, you are eligible for a brand new facility. FEMA will fund a brand new facility, because their thinking is, if it's going to cost over 50% just to put it back the way it was, and in the same area, the same condition, and the likelihood of maybe another like peril affecting that building again is very likely. FEMA doesn't like to pay for things twice, so that's a nice little rule there. So PA that puts you back to where you were before the storm. And again, very lengthy process, lots of project worksheets. I think there's something like 28 steps in the review process for every single project. And so as we always say, it's when you're working with FEMA, it's a marathon and not a sprint. So you need to also be prepared for that. But there are some other programs within FEMA that are not just the traditional PA, and often folks are not aware of these other routes that you can go. And so that's what we're trying to do today, is help educate you guys as to, hey, we need to be aware that there's some other ways to use our eligible funding, but that requires some agreement with FEMA on the front end. You have to make those decisions before you really start moving forward. One of those is the alternate projects lane. And so it may be that you have a building that's damaged, catastrophically damaged, and it doesn't really make sense to put that back the way it was pre-disaster condition, because it really was starting to not fulfill the original, not providing the servicing the community the way it originally did. Needs have changed, etc. So one of the things that you can do is determine that and talk with FEMA about doing an alternate project. So you look at, what is your funding that you would be eligible for, and then you have a conversation with FEMA that, we really don't want to put it back the way that it is, but we'd like to use the money, in a different way. So alternate project funding can be requested, put toward a different facility or facilities. I'll give you an example of my own example. I don't really like to talk about this one too much, just because people have different viewpoints about it, but just an example, okay, of the creativity and the innovative, nature you can take. So in my school district, during Harvey, one of the areas that was significantly impacted was our agricultural barns. Those were for our FFA students. And those barns were in a low-lying area. We were always having, you know, smaller type flood events there, even when we weren't dealing with hurricanes. But they were totally ravaged, you know, during FEMA. And so, during Harvey. And so it did not make sense to build those ag barns back where they were. You know, they were just going to get flooded out again. So, you know, we went through a process of determining what would it, if we had to build this back where it was, you know, what would it take to get it up to code to make sure it wasn't going to flood again. And by the time you got to everything that was needed, it was, I want to say it was a little over $9 million. Okay. Which, you know, these ag barns were built by the parents for the most part, but the district owned them. And so because they were damaged by flooding, there was that amount of money that would be wrapped up in trying to put them at a level that where they wouldn't flood again. Well, the district, you wanted to, you know, that was eligible funding we were eligible for, but instead of putting that towards new ag barns, what we did is we put it towards another project that was in high need, another eligible project. And then we put our ag barn renovation in a bond program, because that's something that parents and community can typically get behind, or those, you know, extracurricular educational opportunities. So we took funding from a, you know, something that was destroyed, but we didn't build it back there, but we took the funding, applied it to another project, got agreement with FEMA up front, and then we got what we needed from a different funding source through our bond program. So that's an example of an alternate project. Another lane that you can go into is alternative procedures projects. And really in FEMA's public assistance program, this offers you maximum flexibility. So let's say that you've got 10 buildings across your entity that have all been damaged in some form or fashion by a fire, an earthquake, whatever. You can put the sum of all of those damages together and then apply them across, instead of going building by building like we talked about earlier and just putting it back the way it was. You can take that funding and then apply it as you see best for the community resilience and recovery at that point. You have to, you know, negotiate that up front with FEMA up front. You come up with a fixed cost across all of those damaged properties, and you negotiate what's that fixed cost that FEMA is going to give us. Now, a caveat there is if you negotiate and agree to a price, and then you find out after you get into these projects that you selected that it's going to cost you more than what you agreed to, that's it. You cannot go back and ask FEMA for more money. But on the flip side, if let's say maybe, you know, you had an idea and your estimates were such that you negotiated an amount with FEMA, but throughout the recovery process you realize, oh, there's some value engineering that we can do, and you know, maybe some projects didn't cost you as much as you originally thought. Whatever that balance is, you get to keep, and as long as you apply it to another FEMA eligible project. So again, nice things to know, you know, before heading in and deciding which way that you're going to go. And then finally, there are improved projects. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to put a building back the way it was, but it's still going to have the same footprint. We want to repair it, but hey, while we're at it, let's go ahead and, you know, add this piece of the project to the overall project. So you know, this funding can be used for improvements to a damaged facility that's not required by eligible codes or standards. FEMA's going to, when you negotiate this with FEMA, they're going to take a look at, you know, what is, you know, what would be your approved estimate of your cost, of FEMA's cost share to you for that pre-disaster design. And they're going to take the lesser of that, or whatever the cost share is. But some examples of an improved project, one that I think makes sense to folks. Let's say you had a firehouse and it was a 2-bay firehouse, flooded out, and you want to, of course, you got to get that up. That's essential services. But the city knows that, hey, we, you know, have known for a long time for this area, we really need a 3-bay firehouse, you know, for 3 fire engines. You can work that into that project and you know, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, if you will. You get the funding from FEMA for the damage piece, but you can still along the way, you know, improve that project to make it something that's even more, effective for the community at that point. All right, another area in FEMA is the hazard mitigation program. Again, I've mentioned already, FEMA doesn't like to pay for things twice, and so they make funding available for projects that will reduce future losses. That's for things like elevation of structures, maybe some infrastructure protection, retrofitting, any kind of, and even the hazard mitigation planning. Back to my school district example, one of the projects that we did was for flood proofing the outside of a big high school that we lost. And so not only flood proofing the exterior, but adding floodgates, that could mitigate damage for future disasters. So there's several things under this hazard mitigation program that we'll talk about. The first is Section 406, and these sections are sections of the Stafford Act. That's why, and so Section 406 in the Stafford Act is where you would find this program outlined. But this type of funding is directly related to the specific declared disaster. So this is mitigation to go along with the damages that you sustain for that specific disaster. Again, I talked about, flood walls, drainage, you can add fire suppression, dry flow proofing, lots of things that, you could think about to make you more resilient for the same type of peril moving forward. Back to my high school example, we, along with our FEMA funding, we got $25 million of FEMA funding for hazard mitigation for that mitigation project I was just describing. So 406, that's tagged to your actual disaster. There is also Section 404 funding, and that funding is also hazard mitigation, but the state, your state of Washington emergency management is going to be kind of driving that funding. It's made available to the state, and then they can, determine what's the best way that we can allocate this across the state to make us more resilient. That type of funding is available not only for damaged buildings, but also for non-damaged facilities that you think you need to further protect on down the road. And again, it's based on a percentage of the dollars that were obligated to your state for public assistance for that specific disaster. And also there's a calculation that goes on for the individual assistance. So like if I, as a homeowner, had to apply for FEMA within my state, that gets folded into, the calculation that FEMA uses to determine, how much 404 is there. I looked on state of Washington's emergency management side, and there's a lot of good information there for you guys if you want to go find out, kind of previous projects that have been funded that way, future projects. They're dealing with some existing projects that they're putting funding out for several counties. So I would encourage you to go take a look at that, just so you're aware of the kinds of things that are often being considered for those types of projects. And then finally, this is a newer version of hazard mitigation. It's been around for a couple of years now, but this is the FEMA BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And, FEMA has, they just kind of took a step back and said, you know what, we need to quit just being reactive, in providing mitigation funding, reacting to these disasters and giving funding. We really need to give people the ability to be innovative, think about what's best for their community, because you and your community know better than anybody, what's the best way for you to make yourselves more resilient, not just FEMA looking at you, from, a specific disaster, and different eyeballs being on that from FEMA from time to time. So BRIC is, a really, I think, a fascinating program. In financial year 22, I've got some numbers on the slide for you about, the amount of money that was available. I made note of several things for the state of Washington that was funded through fiscal year 2022. Yakima, $6 million for a flood control project. City of Goldendale, $9.8 million for a resilience microgrid, like to keep power up and stuff for some really, high impact areas. And then City of Orting, I think is the right word, for a building of a levee. So if you want to go get some interesting information about this BRIC funding and how it's being awarded, there's some of it that is formulaic, but the majority of it is competitive. You've got to submit a proposal along with other, it could be several government agencies. It can also be several government agencies along with a private partnership. So what they've tried to do is just let's open up a program where people can submit their ideas, compete for the funding, pull in all the experts and everybody that they need to come together to really make the biggest impact that they can. If you go to FEMA's website and just search BRIC projects, BRIC projects, you're going to come to that landing page and you can get into the details of all these projects that have been awarded. And again, some really interesting and again innovative ideas that people are using to be able to tap into that funding and take care of some needs and meet some future needs. All right, Kim, I'm going to turn it back to you and let you talk a little bit about some of the HUD funding.
Sure, thanks, Shelley. And Shelley's so smooth. She dropped 2 bombs in her earlier section that you may or may not have noted, so I'm going to point them out. One was under the FEMA PA where she said it's a reimbursement program. And so you have to spend the money and then FEMA decides if you get it back, and you have to have followed all the rules. And one of the places where we see some hiccups in process and procedure is the assumption that when I'm doing my RFPs or my competitive solicitations, I'm only going to apply the federal rules for those areas where I think we're going to use federal dollars. So in the disaster world, we often see that with our debris removal, our debris monitoring, our disaster restoration, when in fact, if you have a large scale catastrophe, those federal dollars are going to touch everything. So we always encourage everybody to think about, if you have a building that burns or a roof collapses in because of heavy snowfall or whatever it may be, you're going to be replacing flooring, you're going to be replacing furniture, your FF&E. So just have that in the back of your mind as you're doing procurements to really think about how you need to pull in and when you need to pull in the federal rules and requirements and processes. The other bomb she dropped was that FEMA is a marathon and not a sprint, and that you have to look at duplication of benefits. So one of the things that I like to share, especially in relation to and we'll get to ARPA, but CARES related money, a lot of agencies used FEMA and CARES concurrently, or FEMA and ARPA concurrently. If you did that, while your ARPA period of performance is 3 years or 5 years, depending on which flavor of ARPA dollars or CARES dollars you had, you still need to retain all of your ARPA documentation as long as you're retaining your FEMA, because FEMA is going to want to see that you didn't double dip. So just understanding that when you start combining sources of funding, especially when they cross over with FEMA, you want to pay attention to your document retention timeframes and pay particular attention to your federal procurement processes. So with that, we're going to, now that I highlighted Shelley's bombs and hopefully it didn't scare you, we're going to move into HUD, CDBG. So this is Community Development Block Grants, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, at least in concept, if not in practice. CDBG is an entitlement program. So that funding comes based on population size, and the formula is complicated, but based on low mod income residents. However, CDBG has 2 different add-ons that are not part of the entitlement, and that's CDBG DR, or disaster recovery, and CDBG mitigation. Both of these funding sources still tie into CDBG's national objectives of reducing slum or blight, reaching low mod income, and addressing urgent needs. However, they just add a little bit of a different take on CDBG funding. So CDBG DR comes out after PA funding. So after there have been preliminary damage assessments, we've got a good idea of the extent of the damage within an area, FEMA PA and FEMA individual assistance comes out. A year later, Congress and others take another look and they say, okay, well, here's our preliminary damage assessment number. Here's how much went out in FEMA dollars. Here's our gap where we still haven't funded. And that's how they figure out this CDBG DR number. And so it's an additional amount of money that comes out about a year later. What's interesting about CDBG DR is that it is one of the only funding sources that can be used as the match for FEMA. So if you're doing a large FEMA permanent work project, say you're rebuilding a building, and your cost share, as Shelley mentioned, typically it's a 75%, 25% split. So you're responsible for the 25%. You are able to use your CDBG DR funding for that 25% if the project meets one of the 3 national objectives. The tricky part is that you have to know way in the beginning that you're planning to use the CDBG DR funding, because as Shelley mentioned, CDBG, that HUD likes to add their own rules and requirements for procurement and processes to the project. And so if you want to combine funding sources, you're now following FEMA's rules and HUD rules, the most restrictive, and then you can do your project and it's funded at 100%. But it's one, aside from CARES, which explicitly stated that it could be used as a match for FEMA, this is the only funding source that has been allowed to be a match for FEMA. So it's interesting from that perspective. A quick example of CDBG DR is, sorry, Shelley, is in a community following Harvey with flooding. It's a creative way to think about this project. And a lot of these projects kind of are public-private partnerships, but there was a low mod income community that was severely impacted. And there was a neighboring community that's a very wealthy community. The shopping center was completely destroyed and it had a grocery store in it. Well, when the city looked at how are we going to spend our CDBG dollars, DR dollars, and what are we going to do? They recognized that the low mod income community actually was a food desert, and their closest grocery store happened to be the grocery store in that higher income community. And so they were able to justify that the impact of rebuilding that shopping center, including the grocery store, actually did meet the national objectives for the low mod income community, and they were able to fund the project that way. So there are some creative ways that you can look at how to meet the low mod income requirements or the national objectives to really improve the community at large. Another CDBG related opportunity for funding is CDBG MIT, which in grant terms is relatively new. 2018 it came out. But again, you can see the shift in trying to be more proactive in disaster resilience versus reactive in disaster response. So this, again, is CDBG through HUD, but it's to carry out high impact activities to mitigate risks and reduce future losses. So increasing resilience. So looking at other ways that your communities can tap into funding and that in your community is going to increase the resilience, especially for those that are low mod income, addressing urgent needs and reducing slumber blight. So again, CDBG mitigation also has to touch one of those national objectives. So those are a couple of disaster resilience programs through HUD. And then we're going to go into ARPA, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with at this point. And we've got depending on what part of the country you're from, SLFRF or SLURF. But this is the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So it's $350 billion that was formulaically distributed to state, local, and tribal governments. I'm sure all of you are well into your spending of SLFRF dollars at this point. Which is interesting because they just released the Flexibility Act a few weeks ago, which increases the things that the eligible projects that you can do with your funding. So the Flexibility Act was supposed to be released in February, I believe. I just side note, I really enjoy how we have to follow the timelines and be compliant, but they don't. So it was supposed to come out in February, it came out in August. But what is nice about it is it's now incorporating national disaster response and preparation, surface transportation infrastructure projects, and then some more CDBG type projects. Although you can, that funding is intended to supplement your existing CDBG projects, not supplant that funding. So with ARPA SLFRF, which the same example that we shared at the beginning, there's definitely opportunity in looking at this funding, especially for those agencies that have not yet decided how they want to spend this funding. And we've actually got quite a few folks that we're working with that are still looking at what they want to do with this funding and trying to assess and do their needs assessments and figure out the biggest bang for their buck. These new eligible categories really help with those communities. And with that,
Kim, I just wanted to share with everybody that one of our colleagues just, I don't know, about a week ago, I guess it was last week, did a free webinar on the ARPA SLFRF Flexibility Act interim rule, kind of letting, giving you the highlights and sort of helping you wade through. It's a large document. And in the session resources that we provided ahead of time to Stacy and team, there's a link for that free webinar for you guys. If you're still dealing with your ARPA funding and you need to understand what this latest little wrinkle is, it's not really a wrinkle, it's just furthering defining, the original program and the uses. That link is available to you in that. All right, and then our final source of funding we're going to talk about briefly is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. This is a large amount of funding that is going to be flowing out for many years to come. And I'm giving you some statistics here on this slide, but really expanding the ability to deal with our nationwide infrastructure, issues that we have. We've got a very aging infrastructure for all, practical purposes, expanding, water, broadband, energy and power, environmental type initiatives. And the funding is both formulaic, but also competitive, right? So there's several lanes that you can, potentially be involved in. And that funding is spread across 12 different federal agencies, which is, even again, making things a little bit more complex for folks. So what I want to say to you is, in procurement, it's so important that you get a copy of your grant agreement with whatever federal agency you're working with, because then okay, I know we're going to have to do uniform guidance procurement rules, but what else has this specific agency added on there? And normally in that grant agreement, you're going to see if there are any additional rules or if there's any administrative relief that's been applied for a specific type of funding. So a lot of times, most of the time when I ask folks, do you guys get copies of your grant agreements and procurement? The answer is usually no, unless it's a really small organization and that person happens to wear multiple hats and they just so happen to be the person that, is the keeper of the grant agreements. But if you've got a grants department or whoever's responsible for that, just ask them, hey, it's really important that we get a copy of that once we've agreed to that so that we know what rules to play by and also can communicate that out. Couple of quick things that I want to just draw your attention to is with Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we are dealing with now the requirement for Build America, Buy America. And I want to distinguish that from Buy American or domestic preference as it's sort of formalized in the uniform guidance. In 2 CFR 200, domestic preference is just that, a preference that you are alerting those contractors and suppliers that are working on your federal projects that we as an organization, we have a preference for products, materials that are made in America. It's again, that's not applying any kind of percentages or anything like that. But when we move over to IIJA funding, we're dealing with something that's a lot steeper hill to climb, and it is actual, you know, allocations that, you know, for your manufactured products that you're applying to your federal project under IIJA, that's started off at 55% has to be made in America. You know, maybe there's components that are made somewhere else, but then they're brought together, and it's to manufacture the final product. It started at 55. There's a graduating scale on that all the way up to 2029, and they're increasing that amount by 5% until we get to 75%. So that means that you're going to have to be very reliant on your suppliers and contractors to provide you that information that they're proposed for the things they're proposing in your solicitations, to be able to give you that information so you can prove that up. It also is a requirement that all of your, you know, steel has to be made in America. All of your construction type products have to be made in America. And now there are some waivers, you know, in the beginning. That's a lot for people to take in, particularly with the supply chain issues that we're all still dealing with. You know, there were some waivers, but it was the responsibility of every agency that receives this funding to apply, you know, the waivers. FEMA, I'll use them as an example. If you go to FEMA's website, FEMA.gov, and you search for IIJA, you're going to hit a landing page, and there's a section there that tells you what FEMA programs require Build America, Buy America, and which ones are waived from that. So PA grants that we discussed a lot today, that does not apply to PA grant, but it applies to other FEMA grants that you may be a party to. So really important that you know a little bit about this, prepare yourself for this. Still a lot of definition coming, you know, and you know, just like our previous example with you know, the ARPA, the recent, you know, just a few weeks ago guidance they provided. We're supposed to be following these rules, but some of the guidance is a little murky, you know, right now. But just be aware that if your organization, if you hear IIJA, we're going after some IIJA funding competitively, that you guys are going to have to ramp up and be sure that you understand those Build America, Buy America requirements. As we mentioned in the beginning, as Stacey mentioned, Kim and I are part of the NIGP Business Council. We have 22 other colleagues across all of these organizations that you see here, and they represent all different sectors of industry. So I want you to be aware that a large part of our mission is not only to provide education, but to provide relevant industry information, trends, things like that, that you all may not have, you know, access to. So please, we want to tell you that we are here as a business council to help you, to point you in the right direction, to provide you with some of that industry knowledge that you may be seeking for certain types of projects. So that can always be, you know, requested via Belinda Seitz, who is sort of our, you know, she keeps us all together as a business council, and she'll get you to the right person. But just wanted you to know who's represented there on the council. And with that, I know we're just a couple of minutes probably to the hour mark, but Kim, I don't know if we had things in chat that we haven't addressed, questions, or we're happy to take any questions that you all might have at this point. I know that's a lot of information in a short amount of time.
I don't see any, but we'll give folks a few seconds. Stacey, I know you have some slides to wrap up as well. So
yeah, not as important as addressing questions though. So we appreciate the guidance, but if we had an if an agency needed help consulting, creating an emergency plan or anything like that, does your company help with those kind of resources?
We do, yeah. And if there's something very, very specific and we've got a very good network and we can help point you in the right direction. So please, if at any point you have questions, feel free to reach out. And I'll say just quickly, Shelley and I often get a one-off question. Hey, I'm putting this debris monitoring bid out. Can you just take a quick look at this section? I'm not sure. That's a quick and easy review and answer for us. So we're happy to be there and help be that sounding board for all of you.
Perfect, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? I know this is a lot of info and we hope not to ever have to need their services, but
Right.
in case we do, we know how to, well, actually, I mean, this deep dive link, that Victor shared with all of us, I'm gonna look into that because I think that's gonna be an additional great resource for all of us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us.
Yes, we've
you.
enjoyed our time with you.
Yeah, and since this is a lunchtime event, a lot of people are going to have to drop off immediately, unfortunately, but that's our reality. Anybody have any questions as people drop off? I don't think so. Well, you guys were so informative. I tried to take notes, and I think I'm gonna want to keep a set of your slides too.
Yeah.
And we'll be able to share that with our group too if they need to look it up as a resource too. Shelley, before you said that there's a few other documents, but it's in the link of this document.
Well, so the PDF I provided you has the slides of our presentation up front, but the last 2 pages there's a resource page that has links to many of the supporting, documentation for the programs that we talked about.
Okay.
And then also at the very end, there's a little 2-page template for an procurement after action review, where if, let's say you've dealt with, COVID funding and you want to take a step back and say, okay, what went well? What did we not do so well with? What actions did we need to take? It's just meant to give you a starting point for discussion via department meetings, whatever, to kind of help you think through some of those things, because that's the best time is once we've kind of gotten, it's best to think about it before, but once we've gotten through one, things don't always go as planned, right? We thought we had a good plan, but maybe it didn't really work out like we thought. And so where are our gaps? Who's going to be responsible for, making sure we close those gaps to be better prepared for the next time. And of course, if there's anything else that folks, would like a point to that we didn't include in those resources, Stacy, just reach out to us or any of you. You've got our contact information. We'll be happy to provide you with something that maybe we didn't think of that you would like to see.
Oh man, well, we look forward to sharing it with folks, and we'll definitely use you as a resource if we need
Yes.
it. We so appreciate this introduction to everything. There's so much more to learn. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Kara, are you getting the copy of the notes and the attendance and all that?
Yeah, Victor just sent me the attendance. But I don't know. He said you can download it from Zoom, so I'll just put it in the Google shared drive, shared docs. So whoever
Yeah.
uploads it
He
can
just
do that.
he just wrote no last slides, another review of the upcoming meetings. Okay. Yeah. It's no need to show the upcoming meetings again. It was not cutting them off was more important. And then I didn't look at any of the links or anything to see